Okay, thank you for your patience. So welcome. My name is Kareem Lennox. I'm a senior lecturer in human rights here at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the School of Advanced Studies. This event is co-hosted with the Institute of Commonwealth Studies along with the Center for the Study of Cultural Memory, which is represented today by Dr. Katia Pizzi. So thank you for joining us. Thank you also to Dr. Joseph Ford for supporting this event today from the Center for the Study of Cultural Memory, which is based in the Institute of Languages, Cultures, and Societies here at the School of Advanced Study. Welcome to all those joining us here in the room and also online. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome back Dr. Rahul Ranjan, who is one of our distinguished alumni of the School of Advanced Study. It's a wonderful occasion to be discussing his book as well, which is based on his work as a PhD student here. His book, The Political Life of Memory, Birsa Munda in Contemporary India, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. He has had a few chances to present it before, but this is the first time he's been able to present it here. So we're particularly delighted to welcome him back to his alma mater for this occasion. To present an important piece of research, which I had the privilege of watching as it developed, along with my fellow co-supervisor, Dr. James Cheringkandak. And it's an exciting piece of both archival and ethnographical research on the iconic Adivasi leader Birsa Munda and his importance for contemporary contentious politics as well. So we'll hear more about that in a moment. I'd like to just say a few more words about Dr. Ranjan. He's currently a lecturer in environmental and climate justice at the School of Geosciences at the University of Edinburgh. So we're happy to have him back in the UK as well. Amongst his other books is an edited volume entitled At the Crossroads of Rights, Forest and Human Rights in Post-Colonial India, published in 2022 by Routledge. In the last decade or so, he's been ethnographically working on long-standing conflicts between social movements, indigenous people struggles, and extractive politics in India. He's also undertaken ethnographic fieldwork in the Western Himalayas and conducted a short pilot study and consultation work in Aotearoa, New Zealand, exploring river rights and community mobilization. And this was part of his postdoctoral research fellowship funded by the Research Council of Norway, entitled Riverine Rights, which was based at Oslo Met. So we look forward to hearing about this book, but also about how this book is building on new research that you're doing today. Welcome back, Rahul. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. One doesn't know where to start. Thank you, Corinne. Thank you so much. It's a bit strange to be back in the school, having finished the PhD. So I've been in this room as a PhD student, and I'm very thankful to you and your supervision that has culminated quite in the book. I'm also thankful to School of Advanced Study, Institute of Commonwealth, and Katia. Thanks for coming and taking our time, and friends and everyone who's taken our time on Friday to come and listen to me. What I thought I'd do today is I'll take you through the journey of the book, key motivations about why I wrote it, then the structure, larger arguments, and what does it mean to work on memory, which is always very fleeting. So the book was conceptualized as a doctoral research dissertation, but had a longer life since I was an MA student in India. And then during my MPhil, I worked on Land Acquisition Act, which is an act that set out conditions for legally occupying land and territory in the name of public purposes infrastructure development. So the project actually emerged during my MPhil, where there was a lot of reference during my interview with lots of indigenous people who are also known as Adivasi. So if I'm using the word Adivasi, it's an interchangeable word for indigenous peoples in India. And so during my MPhil fieldwork, it was made clear by especially women, Adivasi women, that there was huge reference to Birsa Munda. And I'll come to him quickly. And this is a photograph that I'll come to at the end of the book, but this is a photograph painting made by an indigenous artist I had met 4 years ago during my PhD fieldwork 6 years ago. And it was during that point in time when I was doing fieldwork in that area, I had decided that the cover of my book will have to come from within the community. So it can have some sense of reflection of what it means to be writing about these areas. So this is a commissioned painting by an indigenous artist who had to hear me talk about my PhD endlessly over weeks for him to then make a painting that represents what he understood of my project, but also what he thinks of ongoing processes of extraction, violence, also negotiation with the state in India. Okay, I'll be quick. Telling tales. Who counts as a canon in South Asia? So South Asia is a very fraught territory, and I don't represent it. I'm an Indian, but for a long time, canonization process through which individual and communities have been written about and framed, have often represented cultural and political elites. So for a long time, since India's independence, 1947, we've had several literature, and in fact, huge volumes being published about people who are canonized, who are made into this significant figure who had huge contribution in anti-colonial movement, but also in the making of the independent India. But in that literature, there remains a huge and long-standing void where none of the Adivasi scholars have either been recognized as intellectuals or have been recognized enough to be written about as a canon. So the project was also responding to a void, which meant that I had to struggle making a case why it's significant and why it's significant in the place that it should be. I must make it clear that I'm not an indigenous person from India. I've had huge privileges to undertake this project, and a lot of the project was done because I'd had the support that I needed and the care that was presented by kind and generosity of many indigenous scholars that I work very closely with. So the book is not about indigenous people. It's not on them. It's alongside, and it has a reflection about the issue and not the people itself. I also must recognize that not only am I not indigenous, but I also come from high caste. That gives me the privilege to work in India in an uninterrupted scale and ways that constitute power dynamics in South Asia, which is completely defined and largely occupied by caste violence as we speak. So it's important, well, as an anthropologist, but also more generally as someone who works in India, to recognize that this is not a representation of what Adivasis think, but what I did and how I represented it in my own work about a canon. The political life of memory as a whole examines the representation of Birsa Munda, his political life, and kind of how anti-colonialism is framed in India today. It offers contrasting features about political imaginations that are deployed through developing different memorial representation through statues, memorials, and movements. And in doing so, the book kind of frames Birsa Munda, the key character, as the heroic person through grand memorialization, and investigate how built environment curate often selective version of the past. So the book contests that the memorial representation of historical event are often around specific episode, which not only undermine individual contribution within bigger events, but also kind of prioritize histories that are deemed important than other. And in that sense, this book kind of not write backs, but respond to the literary, historical writing that canonize different people in India. So this is a picture of Birsa Munda, who is the key character in the book. Just to give you a brief biography about him, he was a charismatic person who lived for 25 years, very short life to get a revolution done. He was born somewhere in Koti district in 1875 and had to migrate for livelihood purposes with family and endure extreme amounts of poverty. He's a canon for me in my understanding, because he had, in 25 years of his life, used different political and religious motive in order to mobilize his community for staging what is known as Birsa Ul Gulan. And you'll see the word I think it's on the slide as well, but Urgulan basically means revolution, rebellion. And he staged that rebellion at the end of 19th century while he was in his 20s. But the writing that stand as of now, that I have examined, I'm not the biographer of Birsa Munda. K.S. Singh, who also did his PhD at SOAS, wrote the most comprehensive book that looks at the history of Birsa Munda. So I take that book as a point of departure to see where the movement stands today and ways in which memories of movement informs ongoing and emergent forms of environmental and social movement across the state of Jharkhand. One of the key characteristics of the movement was that it left huge cultural imprint within the community. I was really interested in, and I guess that when the project started, it wasn't only about, and Corinne knows, and she's seen me go everywhere, but the project was looking at the contradiction and possibility, can memory be incorporated within what we know as customary law? And if there is any conflict between memory and the ways in which history is constructed. So I draw a lot of strength in the book from wide range of writing that comes from memory studies, lots of work done by Astrid Earle, to name a few, Gyanendra Pandey, Urvashi Butalia, and kind of look at how, if we were to use memory not only for locating eventful points in history, but also everyday formations. So I kind of move away from this kind of memory studies approach to looking at events to act and what happens in everyday formation of memory in the state. And in doing so, I look at this canon. There were several things that came about in his life. There's several contesting narrative. And I'm just trying to condense these bigger things you will find at great length in the book. But there was two big narrative. One narrative, more or less, was by historian who had framed the movement as a millenarian movement that is driven by passion and often characterized as illogical, and therefore does not recognize the method that are used in doing that. And then the other kind of narrative that existed about the movement characterized indigenous people with racialized stereotype, such as primitive, bygone from the past. So he was not only deemed as a healer, as a Bhagwan, which is a kind of a demigod, and is an active attempt by right wing in the India at the moment to characterize him under the guise of a Bhagwan. So to incorporate indigenous group within the mainstream Hindu caste fold. So kind of this book stand at that juncture of responding to various kinds of characterization that Birsa Munda had to face. So the book is divided in two parts. The first part of the book looks at historical memory, which is a research that I undertook at 3 different archival institutions, including British Library, which has huge reserve of resources, but also at Cadbury Library at University of Birmingham, which has one of the most fantastic archive for studying missionaries in India. And then I did some research within the state archive in the state of Jharkhand. And I kind of contest this characterization of missionaries as homogeneous group in the book to argue how you cannot use this framing of missionaries as necessarily invader. And in fact, in the long run and in the contemporary India, could actually go on to target minority groups. So I provide this long extended account of a different missionary group that came between 1854 to 1900. And I must say, I took up this period only because Birsa Munda movement happened, but the history is much longer, and I make reference to other people who have done extended work. But this period was interesting because this is an area where he was born was also completely devastated by agricultural crop failure, huge famine, which meant there was a huge out-migration happening from the state. This is also the state from where Adivasis were forcefully moved on to tea plantation work in northeast of the India in Assam, and had to leave their properties behind, moving in search of employment and livelihood. So I present an account of how these complicated history could be condensed into simplified notions of millenarian movement versus racialized stereotype. And what I offer is a more kind of open broader worldview about the movement that's situated in an interplay between uh, you know outsiders coming in at the same time when India is still under colonial rule, including missionary groups, but as well as dominantly the upper caste who was holding land titles quite a lot. This is just another illustration of a photograph that I found at Central Mission Society archive at University of Birmingham, which kind of was very helpful in also reframing the question of who is missionary, and it's not never a one person. And I kind of show how, had it not been, and I'm saying this with a sense of awareness that it's a complicated question and remains open to contestation. But had it not been missionaries in this area at the end of 19th century, when Birsa Munda movement was happening, perhaps Adivasi would have lost in retrospectively more than what they did. So a lot of missionary, and especially I show in the book, the German missionary who were known as Gosners, actually did political campaigning and helped Adivasi go to court. Just imagine a community that has survived for hundreds of years without needing an evidence to prove that they live where they have for generation, had to face a legal administrative infrastructure introduced by colonial power, at the same time huge amount of migration, as well as a situation in which they do not know how to litigate in the court. So missionaries actually became foot soldiers in providing that kind of assistance required. And it's a conflicted question in a book, and I go on to show that what is it that it takes for one to be converted? And it's a longer question that I don't really get into. But I want to move away from the simplified, oriented, politically motivated narratives about missionaries as invaders. Then the book kind of moves away, and because it's a project which was about history and memory conflict, I was also trying to teach myself what is it, when is it, memory is rendered visible, and what is it that we call memory? Is it, in most times, memory was just simply another representation of history. But through the project, I kind of explore how embodied forms of cultural experiences are also registers of history, not in the way history is understood as often linearly progressing, but memory is more flat, most experiential. It's an embodied account of experiences from the past. It's not history, it's a representation of historical events. And in that sense, memory becomes more textured, more oriented towards giving detailed, personalized experiences of an event. And in that, I kind of look at how Adivasi's present past cannot be understood similarly through historical time scale, where you're linearly progressing, whereas it's more in kind of a continuum between past and present, and one informs the other. These are just a photograph to illustrate how everydayness, everyday part of being in forest, being among ancestor through burial stone, co-constitute the life world of Adivasi. So these modern fragmented understanding of landscape as only oriented towards financial transactions don't really hold within the community a strong meaning that we might have from outside. So a lot of what we call as forest are also spaces of dwelling for the spirit. So if you're going to cut down the forest and flatten it, you're also disembodying, removing ancestors. And this is not also just to say, to valorize that as though indigenous people are exception in the way they make sense of the world, but it's also common within different other communities elsewhere, because I look at like larger literature around Aboriginal histories in Canada and in Australia. And there are really striking similarities in the way they conceptualize past and present. So there are 3 chapters that are ethnographic memory as opposed to historical, where I look at statues, memorials, and then movement. I've decided not to go on too much detail, so I'm leaving out memorials and statues. And I'm only looking at movement. So this is a movement called Pathalgari movement, which happened, had been happening since 1990s, but had heightened at the time I was doing the field work. And because the project was oriented towards looking at history, memory, conflict, this movement got heightened to a point where there were many arrests and subsequently followed by a lot of order for a political order for arrest of many other people who were within that area where I did my fieldwork. But the movement basically was about reinstating constitutional safeguards that are given to different indigenous groups in India that maintain their right to self-rule. And what was interesting about this movement was that this movement kind of simply, in order to strategize, used one single word called non-judicial area in one of these slabs. I think, don't know if you can read it, but it's here. And that sent moral panic to the state because they suggested that somehow Adivasis are seeking sovereignty as opposed to, let's say, self-rule very much within the democratic structure of India and guaranteed by the constitution. But when I came back to London to write my PhD at the final stage, I was struggling how this movement could fit into a project which is about a canon, and I'm trying to canonize a person. And it was during that period and hundreds of discussions with Corinne, my other friend Lily, that I had had the time to think that it was actually, I was kind of reinforcing the canonization I was responding to. So I was trying to frame Birsa as this one big giant person, whereas within the community and for my stay in a long spell, there were many movements, and I heard my interviews back to myself, that many ordinary elders in the community had never referred to him as a canon. They often said he was first a Munda, which is his primary tribe. He was second a Adivasi, and third he's Birsa Munda. So the sense of one among equal was something that I brought back with me, and I heard it again, and kind of looked at this selection of memorial plaque, the burial stone as a site of protest, makes it clear that the history and memory kind of memory works in a continuum. So the reason that they selected in an age where social media is saturated by different kinds of modern methods of protest, the reason that an indigenous community has chosen their burial stone to engrave parts of Indian constitution to guarantee the rights tells you that the memory actually informs the landscape in the way they understand. And I guess in that sense, this also kind of brought me back because in late 19th century, while I was doing my archival research, there were records where Adivasis were seen carrying stones down from Jharkhand to Calcutta, it's about 500 kilometers, on their shoulders, burials of their ancestor, to the court to prove that they belong. So the burials were not simply just stone, but where they were markers of their memorial territory. And I kind of use this chapter to combine the book together and argue for how we have to open ourselves, at least in India, to possibilities of thinking about memorialization in different ways. And I proposed kind of two manifesto at the end of the book, which you don't have to necessarily look. But at the end of the book, I kind of argue that memory as politics remain very evident in India, more generally in South Asia, and it kind of becomes a structuring affect, the main tool that describes some of the events, individuals who don't get captured and written into in history because they don't come from culturally and politically elite groups. But I'll end here and open up to Q&A. Am I doing good on time?
We 1 o'clock, so
Yeah.
very good. Yeah. Thank you,
Thanks.
Rahul. It's a great fun with help. Thank you.